fight for gender equality, I call upon Prime Minister to begin this debate. Hear, hear.
Hello? Here in Japan, when you go to a convenience store, when you flip over to the magazine section, you see an array of magazines with only women on it. Women very skimpily dressed, but none of men. So when you turn on the TV, you see tons of sexual images of women, but you don't see that many of men. So what are we going to do in OG about it? In opening government, we'll be really excited to aggressively sexualize men. What will we do about it? We will ensure that television programs will have tons of images of men in sexualized ways. Men being sexual beings and men in very, very sexual ways. So what do we mean by this? We'll also sexualize men from a diverse group of individuals. That means that we'll sexualize homosexual men, we'll sexualize straight men, we'll sexualize men of various different races, white, black, Asian, and so on. We'll also sexualize men from various different age group above the minors, of course. So what will we hope to achieve in this debate? No, thank you. So we will achieve two things in this debate. Number one, we will reduce objectification of women. And number two, we will return sexual autonomy to women in order to ensure that women and homosexual men will be recognized as having sexual desires in society. And we'll tell you why that's particularly important in this debate. So, first question that we need to ask, is there a difference between sexualization and objectification? We say that there's a huge amount of difference. Sexualization is recognizing that I am human and I have sexual desires, that I can be a sexual being and part of me, maybe in your opinion or not, can be sexy. But objectification is only recognizing parts of my body as being desirable. Not that I am a human being, not that I have feelings, not that I have personality. So there's a huge difference between sexualization and objectification. But in today, we realize that a lot of women are being objectified as well as sexualized. But we can't ever solve that because it's impossible to completely desexualize women. No matter how hard you try, you can't completely desexualize women and remove every ability of straight men and lesbian women to view women as a sexual being. Given that you can't, an opposition, unless they prove beyond reasonable doubt that they're able to desexualize women, don't have a solution to the gender inequality when it comes to objectification. So the only solution we have to ensure that objectification is an issue that we take seriously between either men and women is to allow men and women to both be sexualized and recognize the limits of sexualization and where that stands. The limit of sexualization is when individuals stop being seen as sexual beings but being seen just for their body parts and nothing more than that. That men will be seen as just their thing and their XX, whatever those things are, and not as human beings as well. So we think the only way men can develop empathy is to recognize which part and where they stand when it comes to the line of sexualization and objectification. No, thank you. So how do we reduce objectification? So the moment in which men start to realize that they are also being objectified, they start to realize where they're being sexualized and whether they're being objectified. Men under status quo hardly realize the difference. They think that if they catcall women on the street, they're giving them a compliment. If they say, hey beautiful, nice ass, they think they're giving that woman a compliment. But when you reverse that, and men get used to being called, hello sexy, and they don't feel good about it, they start to realize that that's objectification. And that can only happen the moment in which we normalize sexualization towards men. Then in that same breath, men join the fight against objectification. Then the enemy is no longer men or women. The enemy isn't that all men are horrible beings. The enemy are every individual that objectify people are horrible, regardless of whether you're men or women. When both genders join the fight, that's the only way in which you can create real empathy for objectification and ensure that everyone joins this conversation about objectification. And that's the only way we can do that is by aggressively sexualizing men. The reason why we need to aggressively do this is because it's not enough to just sexualize one or two men. We need to completely rewrite the narrative of whether men are sexual beings or not. Right now, men are barely being sexualized. But that's why we need to flood images of men being sexualized so that they can also understand what sexualization feels like, whether it feels good and when it doesn't feel good, which is when they're being objectified. Go ahead.
When men become victims of sexualization, are they not going to blame the women who are sexualizing them for their feeling of discomfort and not create the empathy that you're talking about?
That is odd. So I don't think that will happen. So what will happen is that men realizes that some men objectify women and they are finally able to understand how it feels like for those women to be in their shoes. So they're finally able to create sympathy. Yes, perhaps they'll be angry at certain women, but they realize the problem that those other women who are victims face as well. And that's the thing that we needed to create. We needed them to understand how victims feel, for them to join the fight and recognize that they are all victims of this thing called objectification. And now they have to participate in the fight. Second thing that we will achieve is that we will increase the sexual autonomy of women as well as homosexual men. How do we do this? Right now, we barely recognize that women are also sexual beings, that straight women also desire men, that men can be very sexy in the eyes of a lot of women. Right now, when women say, that guy's really hot, to a lot of people, she's a slut. Because how is it possible that a woman can be a sexual being? To a lot of conservative society, they cannot understand nor conceptualize why a woman can sexualize a man. But if you normalize the sexualization of men, more women start talking about what they like in a man, what makes a guy sexy. Why is it that they as women, as straight women, also have sexual feelings? This does a couple of things. This removes things like slut shaming, because every woman realizes that they also have sexual desire, and that's nothing to be ashamed of. That removes things like over-scandalizing women for being very sexual. Like, for example, when a women politician gets into any form of sexual scandal, that becomes a huge deal, and we care so much about that. Right now, that wouldn't be a thing anymore, because it's normal that women are sexual beings. At the end of my speech, I need all of you to realize that we cannot desexualize women, nor is it possible to entirely do that. So what we must do is make men understand the difference between sexualization and objectification and help them join this fight against the patriarchy. We're extremely proud to propose.
I thank Prime Minister for that speech. I now call upon Leader of Opposition to begin the case of the offside. Hear, hear.
So we agree the problem regarding the sexualization or objectification of the women in the society. But we believe the solution should be this, right? Because this policy actually reverses the current trend that gradually opposing the sexualization or unequal treatment towards the women. Our stance is that we should, as the guardian of the women's right, that we should both of the men and the females sexualization, and we have to try to tackle down, try to decrease the amount of sexualization and objectification. This is our stance. So based on this, I'll talk about three issues. Firstly, what we should achieve as a guardian of the women, right? And what kind of equality is the most ideal one we should pursue. And secondly, I will talk about I will clarify the context of today's debate and why this current society is gradually transiting from the past very misogynistic society and towards a very liberal society, why this policy is going to reverse that current effort and trend, and certainly how our model, our policy is relatively better to tackle the very problem the Prime Minister described. Before that, to independently respond to the Prime Minister, first they said that these men realize the objectification as the somewhat something called uncomfortable and something problematic. But thing is that if these men cannot imagine that the discomfort of the sexualization by just told that this sexualization is somewhat very unequal and very uncomfortable, then probably these people cannot imagine the suffering of the sexualization. Although they see that they actually recognize this sexualization as their own experience, and this is problematic as same as the women's one. So I don't think this policy is going to solve that. Secondly, they talked about how this policy is going to liberate women in terms of their sexual autonomy. But I don't think that this policy is exclusive to solve the problem, right? Because we think that women are currently making the effort to liberate women, and women should have the sexual autonomy, and women should be able to choose whether they're going to be sexualized or whether they're going to prefer certain sexual intercourse, etc. And we think that our policy is relatively negative, right? Because our policy actually opposes the sexualization of objectification that pressures women to sexualize, and we think that our policy is better to reduce that pressure and enable women to choose whether they're going to sexualize or whether they're going to prefer the sexual intercourse or how they're going to behave in society. So having said that, I'll move on to my first issue, right? So what we have to recognize here is that this policy may make situation technically and theoretically equal, right? Which means that both of the men and women are sexualized and both of men and women are victimized as a result of sexualization. But I don't think that the some ideal form of the inequality or ideal form of the consequence that we should achieve as a guardian of the women's right. Because the society we have to achieve is that society or situation where which is inclusive for the all kind of women or maybe all kind of men, regardless of the biological features, regardless of the their features, etc. Right? And we believe that if we continue to justify and if we continue to legitimize both of men and women as by the sexualization objectification, as a result of this, that some women or men that who cannot fit the current trend of the sexiness, current trend of the attractiveness, are going to be suffer and are going to be recognized as the less attractive and less beautiful. And we think it's quite problematic. So having said that, moving on to my second issue about the context of today's debate and how this policy is counterproductive. So what we have to recognize is that the context of today's debate is not, we accept that the current society is not that perfect regarding the liberating women for the sexualization. But we believe that currently the society is gradually changing. For example, when it comes to the very excessive objectification, excessive sexualization, such as the nudity on the advertisement, or maybe very sexually arousing posing, sexually arousing behavior in the advertisement or in the movie are going to be bashed and criticized in the society. But we will still, there's some sort of subtler form, or relatively subtle form of the sexualization out there, even in the status quo. That such as, for example, the company or society actually prefers the women who with the makeup rather than the women without makeup. Or maybe companies prefer the women with the skirts rather than the trousers. So we believe the society, although society recognizes that the existing form of the sexualization problem, the society isn't that mature to the extent that they are recognizing that the more subtle form of the sexualization as a problem, as a discriminatory and exclusive to someone. We believe that in that kind of situation, that this policy is extremely dangerous in two ways, right? Because firstly, that this policy allows the men or the people who consume the women's sexualization to use the rhetoric that now men are the one also sexualized and objectified in the form in the maybe TV program or in the advertisement or fashion magazine, etc. And we see that in that kind of circumstances, that rhetoric of the feminist movement that claims that the women's sexualization is somewhat problematic is going to be undermined because it's something that men also are victimized, and it's not something that women are exclusive for the women. And we think this is going to undermine the power of the words of the feminist movement. But secondly, we believe that males are going to feel that they are the one who are victim and they are the one who are exploited and consumed by the female, right? And we believe that this is extreme, especially for the women, for the men who cannot, unfortunately, who cannot fit the current trend of the sexiness or like attractiveness. And we think it's quite like problematic, right? Because the understanding of men or empathy from the men is quite like very important when it comes to the tackling the issue of the women's sexualization. Because the men are the ones who are currently consuming and exploiting women. By their own like sexualization and objectification. So we believe that those kind of understandings are going to be undermined and cut by this policy. We think it's quite problematic. So lastly, why like our policy is relatively better, right? So I've already clarified in my introduction that our policy is going to like condemn and blame and try to like decrease the amount of sexualization, both of the like men's sexualization and also the women's sexualization. So by doing so, we can like strengthen like narratives that the sexualization like the current like trend like norm that is exclusive to the men and women who have like certain like biological features that cannot fit the current trend of the sexiness, current trend of attractiveness. So by like continuing to do so, like we can push the current like society that like actually opposes the existing form of sexualization in beyond the further and to the extent that they are going to also recognize the more like subtle form of sexualization. By doing so, we can rather like liberate the women as to have sexual autonomy and also liberate women to choose their behavior and choice we oppose.
I thank Leader of Opposition for that speech. I now call upon Deputy Prime Minister to present the case for offside. Hear.
So today we are introducing two key points from the Armenian government. So firstly we said this motion is uniquely needs the empathy from men to differentiate between the objectification and the sexualization. So here comes the point that is sexualization the same as the objectification? And our answer is no. And to have the men realize the subtle difference is here's the only way to have that to have the men in that position itself. And second one is that we are going to let the women to have the sexual autonomy today that women do not have. So first I'm going to talk about the men's reaction, whether or not this is going to be offensive towards the feminist movement. And secondly, I'm going to talk about, I'm going to extend the idea of female autonomy in sexual activity. Or refutation is going to be included. So firstly about the men's reaction. So firstly, about this motion is going to undermine the message that feminist movement has been sending, the sexualization is a bad thing. But as I already told you, the sexualization is something that the very human being thing. So human being is going to sexualize as long as they have the sexual desire. However, the objectification is something very different. And Jasmine introduced a very smart solution to differentiate the objectification from the sexualization is the way to go. And secondly, they say, on the one hand, they say, even if the man is going to be sexualized, men are not going to realize how the objectification is a bad thing. But on the other hand, conveniently, they said, condemnation and explanation, the blaming somehow works. We do not allow them to have that convenient contradiction within their motion, right? And we're going to say the likelihood that you're going to realize the sexualization is a bad thing. We have the higher ground to have them because the men are now in that position that women has been there, right? And thirdly, and I'm going to answer toward the point of information. So they say men are going to react very aggressively towards this motion. But as Jasmine told you, there are first group of the men. They are going to be sympathized women to how bad the situation was. And secondly, we agree that in the short term, men are going to react very aggressively, so that men are going to say, now women act very badly, or now we are victims, or whatsoever. But we say, in the long term, the enemy is no longer the woman. Men and women are going to realize the enemy are both shared by the women and men. The enemy is the objectification itself, not the women or the men. No, thank you. And thirdly, we say
So those men who are going to blame the feminist movement just because we are going to sexualize them is the men who are not going to change anyways, right? We say those groups of the men is, for example, manosphere men, the men's going to men who are very women haters. Those people are helpless. Those are the people who hate the women as long as they are just a feminist, right? So we think regardless of if we are going to aggressively sexualize or not, those men are going to hate the women anyways. So we don't think that actors are the most important one in today's debate. So second, I'm going to extend the idea of the female autonomy, but before that, yes.
What is the difference between sexualization and objectification when you say that harm only happens when there's objectification and you want to hurt men, so you create some degree of sympathy? Is there really a distinction if you still want to hurt men?
So there's no logical distinction between the objectification and sexualization. That is the problem, right? We ourselves do not hear the nuance, subtle nuance between the objectification and sexualization, but yet there is a time. For example, when you see the man naked and shower in the Wonder Woman movie, you do not feel offended even if you're a man. However, if you see the man aggressively treated as some object and the only thing deprived of the personality, then you're going to feel like you're being treated as object, right? We believe when so many individuals aggressively sexualize men at the same time, there are diversity or variety types of the sexualization. And sure, some part of it include the objectification, and that part is going to let men realize the difference between the objectification and the sexualization. So second matter about the sexual autonomy. So now I'm going to talk about victim blaming that happens so often in recent context, right? So when woman is voluntarily sexualize herself or forcibly sexualize herself, many men or boys feel like they can do whatever they want because now she is exposed her skin or her sexual attitude towards the other people, right? However, this is not the case, right? We believe even if person is sexualized, yet the autonomy of yes or no or sexual autonomy is within the one who is sexualized right now, right? However, men do not realize, men always believe that sexualized autonomy is a man thing, and whether or not you take action is always lived upon the man's side. However, the sexualization happens to men, and if the woman say, now we are being sexualized, so we can do whatever I want to towards boys, now the boys are going to realize, no, that's not the case. Sexualization or whether or not I'm sexualized is two things different. So now the man and woman can say out loud, so autonomy is something different whether or not I am sexualized myself or not, right? So now the victim blaming are no longer going to happen, right? Because even if you are sexualized yourself or even if you sexualize somebody else, it's something different between you can do whatever you want to do. And secondly, I'd like to talk about the concept of weak woman or strong woman. Opposition side might say this motion is going to be offensive or going to be harmful for the weak woman who cannot voice out to say no towards the man. Now the sexualization happens so a lot. We do not think so, because after this motion is taken and sexualization become some different things from the objectification, the sense that weakness or strongness is something apart from the concept of the sexualization. So even the weak women are allowed to have the sexual desire to have sexual activity with men, right? Now under the status quo, it is believed that only strong woman is wanting to have the sexual activity with the man. It is not true. Regardless of the woman being weak or the strong, the sexual desire is something human and something personal. So that's two things is going to be realized. That's why we stand in the opening government. Thank you.
I thank Deputy Prime Minister for that excellent speech. I now call upon Delegate Leader of Opposition to extend the case for OO. Hear, hear.
In a society where a commercial for a perfume, which a female model was aggressively sexualized, had been condemned, and in a society with that kind of condemnation can coexist with female celebrities showing their own bodies to be able to sexualize themselves, we don't think the aggressive sexualization is something that we need in a society. We rather think this policy or this action which is caused by this motion would result in a different reaction which the government side assumes. That's why we do not want this policy to happen, and that's why we oppose this motion. 3 things that I want to talk about in this speech. First is when government side sort of assumes men as a big, huge rock which will have some kind of similar action, how this is rather actually not true. There's a very multitude of men existing in society, and if you rather consider who the people are causing the problem right now of sexualization, the consequences of aggressively sexualizing women is not what government side wants to happen. It rather exacerbates the situation and is no good. The second thing I want to analyze is if you really want to consider the problem of women being able to sexualize themselves, is this policy something that we really need? And finally, if I have time, I'll rather further analyze how the society in the right now is rather a better society to improve on the status of women. All my refutations will be integrated in my speech. Moving on to the first argument. So the first argument is that the government's assumption is that those who catcall will have a change of heart when they suddenly see those things on TV. Well, we don't think these kind of things are true rather in the status quo. Because even in the status quo, we see videos, or for example, women who are just walking around the New York streets for an hour being catcalled hundreds of times. And we see men who are sympathizing these things, not because they were offended, but because as human beings, decent human beings, they can think that that woman which is being harassed right now might be his daughter, might be his mother, or might be his wife. We think this kind of decent sympathy is something that we have in people's minds, and we think that kind of sympathy for the victims of sexualization is something that happens regardless of this kind of aggressive sexualization of men. But if you think about that factor, if that is already happening in the status quo, we have to look at the other side. There's still people, even when we see these kind of videos, even when we see people commenting on Facebook or speaking out on how sexualization is harmful for them as themselves, or how sexualization in itself is something harmful, there's people who still don't take action and don't think that much of a problem. These are probably people, first of all, who don't think sexualization as much of a problem. These people, who are more likely, even if they're catcalled for themselves, would rather think it as a compliment and don't think it as a problem. But another thing we have to realize in society is that catcalling for women, or sexualization on women, has a completely different meaning for what is sexualization for men. Because if you look at sexualization for women, it's not only about the catcalling or only seeing porn magazines on the shelf of streets. It's another part of the misogynistic society which always judges her based on her appearances in every aspect of her life, in job, in schools, in every single aspect, every single moment that she's living. But for men, even if they see these kind of sexualized items within the street, it doesn't harm them because it's just within the magazine rack. It doesn't come back to their personality. They don't have to think about their bosses who are again going to be harassing them the next morning or the next day. So rather what happens for these kind of men is that even if they see these kind of things, they don't think it was a problem. So if you consider how these kind of different character of men exist in society, what the policy of government side does is not what government side would want us to believe. Rather what would happen is now that these men who think sexualization is something okay, or who think sexualization isn't that much of a problem for themselves, would rather now see that now in a society where men are being aggressively sexualized, they think it's something normal. They think it's a compliment. They would rather want to engage in with other things. They'll be probably happy when they're sexually catcalled. But the problem with this kind of change, or the lack of change that might be, is that the problem which sexualization causes amongst the people is still there. The people who don't want to be sexualized, which is in the case of government speaking, who will be objectified, will still feel those pains within those people's hearts. But the important part of this argument is that this policy doesn't change anything. It just worsens the situation. But that's why government policy is something different. They fail to tell us why the kind of variety of men who are already causing the problem right now would change. It doesn't matter if the other people unite against it. It's because other people will unite against it regardless. So that's the conclusion of my first argument. Yes?
So if the men do not believe that sexualization is a bad thing under our paradigm, how is it going to be solved under your paradigm?
So that I'll be answering the third part, but the brief answer to that will be, sexualization will be something that the people can always unifiably condemn. It's something that cannot be tolerated in any kind of sense, and that way people will probably not talk about it, people will probably not do about it, and that's why in society, if you look what's happening right now, there is cracking down on sexualization. People are fighting against it. So those kind of changes still exist in society. The problem is what happens in regard of this motion, and we're telling you it's going to make things worse. Moving on to the second part of my argument is the whole argument of sexual autonomy. So government side is trying to talk about, oh, we want to change the sexual perception for these women themselves. What they fail to tell us is why this is the only way. Because in a society where we start to condemn sexualization, we start to say you shouldn't be forced sexualization among themselves. The flip side of the society is that people start to think that, okay, sexualization is something that these individuals should be able to control. That's why in the current society, you see artists, like for example Beyonce, talking about the way how women can be sexually thinking about themselves and can promote their self-bodies. And you can see those kind of artists coexisting with criticizations against sexualization in some sort of magazines where they treat women as things. We live in a society like that, and we don't live in an imaginary land where those kind of criticizations do not coexist. That's why we don't think the kind of criticization they're talking about in government side is something that we require in the society. Moving on to the final argument, which is better than the further past? So the kind of the answer to the POI coming from opening government. So we think there's two crucial differences in government side and opposition side. The first crucial difference is that there is an absolute narrative against sexualization inside opposition. It is not going to be tolerated, and there's no subtle nuance that people have to turn their way around. So it's very easier for the layman or the ordinary man to understand that sexualization is something bad when you just told it's something absolutely evil. But when you're told that, for example, in a society where sexualization can be sometimes okay, but sometimes cannot be okay, it kind of differs about the scenario, it's very hard for the people to understand. That's why in the current society, people are kind of think it's something okay and sometimes doing catcalls. So I think those kind of changes are remaining the status that sexualization is something crucially bad, is something more important. The second difference is that we don't have to victimize the men who are doing so. When we victimize the men in doing so, they have the antipathy against these kind of things happening. It's unlikely that these people are going to help their voices, they're rather just going to back it up. So for all these arguments, we think that the rather action which is going to happen by this motion is not what government side says. It's going to make the situation worse if you consider what kind of men actually exist in society. So for all these reasons, we're proud to oppose. Thank you very much.
I thank Deputy Leader of Opposition for that speech. I now call upon Member of Government to begin the closing house. Hear, hear.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. So from closing government, we would like to do two things to contribute to this debate. Firstly, we would like to end the discussion about which can bring the long-term change to end this fight against gender inequality, because opening half the debate was talking about which actors can bring changes, but never really concluded this argument by which actors are most influenced after all. But secondly, we also would like to tell you what kind of empowerment specifically given by the aggressive sexualization, uniquely by the hand of the female oppressed organization like we do in this motion. So based on that, I have two things to tell you. First, about what sort of empowerment is given to women, and when, especially in the context where the women can access to the sexual figure of men, especially given by the perspective of female, but secondly about how this motion can bring long-term change to society. So, but before moving on to my argument, I have one rebuttal that doesn't quite fit in. So from the very last part of the Deputy Leader of Opposition, he has talked about how it's easier to combat this gender inequality when we portray sexualization as absolute bad. First and foremost, we don't understand how that can be, how they can illustrate this illustration by absolute bad, when the large part of the discussion about sexualization is only in the hand of male. Women do not have a power to represent themselves in this kind of discussion when they say this form of sexualization is bad, this form of objectification is bad. We don't understand how on their part they can achieve that goal. But secondly, even if that happens, right, we think that's a contradiction to their side of the house, because they are afraid of men getting angry, right? Once male actually are criticized being absolute evil and absolute bad, and what happens under your paradigm, right? That happens the same thing. It further makes this male group of male more angry, and I don't understand how under your paradigm you can solve that problem. So moving on to my first issue, right? What sort of empowerment is given to women? But before that, yes.
Look, it's not our burden to prove any alternative. Our burden is to prove that this model will make status quo worse and more unsafe for women. If we're able to do that because men are more aggressive, we win.
Maybe, right? But we don't understand. We think status quo is serious enough. When the women cannot represent themselves because they cannot voice out to say, because they don't want to be seen as slutty and so forth. So, good luck on that, right? So moving on to the first issue, what sort of empowerment is uniquely given? So, the problem we identified under status quo that the opening government never really illustrated is that the thing that this sexualization under their paradigm is only given by the perspective of the male. Therefore, what it means is that this industry that actually surrounds this entire sexual, like magazines and like pornography, and all those things are created through the perspective of the male. So why is that bad? We think that's bad because females actually want other stuff to satisfy their desire to consume, because they may want not the submissive submissive illustration of the pornography that the men prefers to have, but they may want to have other form of pornography or magazines that actually illustrate the equal status being had in this bedroom, or they may have more aggressive attitude, right? We think those things are going to be lost under their paradigm, because we cannot have any sort of discussion what the female actually wants, right? So the unique empowerment that this motion can actually give is that this motion is actually portrays women's sexual desire by women's unique perspective that it's never going to be achieved under their paradigm, which means that when they access to this kind of goods, when they actually when they buy certain kind of products, the things that they want can be bought under our paradigm, because now the industry realizes there are actually desires and there are actually needs for the women to actually consume this kind of goods, right? We think this kind of industrial change is very important compared to very, very important, because that cannot be brought under their paradigm when the female are seen as non-sexually desiring person, right? So we think this is particularly important when opening government didn't conclude the argument to say what kind of actually concrete change can give it and what kind of benefit that women can gain under our paradigm. So secondly, moving on, right? How this motion will bring a long-term shift or the win to the fight against the gender inequality, right? So the uniqueness of this motion is that this sexualization happened in public sphere. That means we can have discourse about it when one side is sexualized and one have the opinions, and we can have a larger expose to many segments of citizens, including young people, including the moderate individuals, right? So we think that's beneficial for two main reasons. Firstly, we can access to the most liberated people who have the possibility to be liberated, called younger generations, right? We think those younger generations are very important to bring a positive change to society. When the actually young generations are the most involved people in this kind of sexual discourse, right? We think those people can actually have a better creative mindset to say actually this kind of sexualization is actually fine, right? And we think when that happens, we think the society move to try to listen to the voices of female. But yes.
So are you trying to convince the younger generation that the solution to victimizing half the population is to victimize the other half to make things fair?
Okay, I think when these people do not the young generation cannot realize what they're doing is bad, but I think they should realize in that way. Maybe in anger for a short period of time, but it's a serious problem. But secondly, we think it brings a positive political discourse, right? Because what happens under their paradigm is that they suppress the discourse because they are the one disproportionately punishing the male for being sexual, because they want to portray this as absolutely bad, right? So what happens under our paradigm though is that when the male feel a little bit slightly offended or they don't feel comfortable, they can also bring up that in the discourse to say that I don't want to be harassed, I don't want to be sexualized in this manner, right? That actually helps the discourse, a private discourse, to have the women can also realize that the male have certain bars that they don't want to be crossed, and we think that discourse is particularly important because the private issues or these sexualization issues is the fundamental desire for human being that we have to engage in this kind of activity, then we should have a fair discourse, and that's the reason why we're very happy to propose.
I thank Member of Government for that speech. I now call upon Member of Opposition to begin the case for closing comment. Hear, hear.
When children are dying due to bullying, the solution or the reaction ought not to be making all of the children subjected to bullying, even if it equalizes or sharing some sympathy or damages associated with the bullying whatsoever. When poverty exists uniquely for single mother in Japanese context, the solution ought not to be make all men divorce forcibly and all the men take care of his children in order to relatively empower and recognize the kind of plight associated with single mothers. Few clarifications before moving on to three key extensions coming from closing off. One, it is not our burden once again to completely solve the situation because we know the status quo is harsh, but the thing is that this policy makes the situation far worse and far worse imaginable. But furthermore, I've heard the situation of this debate by look, we're not necessarily saying sexualization per se is bad. We're not going to be prohibiting on affirmative pitch even that people try to make him or herself sexy in order to make big appearing, for example. The point is how sexual aggressive form of sexualization is bad, and the point of aggressiveness is identified through the contextual identification, which I'm going to make in my extension. This policy is a kind of policy which punishes two relevant actors disproportionately unfairly and will empower one group which does not lead to the reduction of gender inequality. Three things. One, it harms women far more by creating the entrenching the culture of sexualization. Impact leads to two forms. One, it does not share the vulnerability in which affirmative prevention wants to have. Second, it decapacitates the current trend of female making the outcry against the aggressive sexualization as well as the rape culture it pre-exists right now. Second extension is this, it's punishing the wrong actor. For example, the vulnerable men, for example, given that all men cannot be Cristiano Ronaldo suddenly, so even if we achieve empathy or equality, we don't value such form of equality, and that's the value judgment we're going to offer. But lastly, even if all these assumption, by taking these policies, in theory, both men sympathize and understand the kind of right. In the real world, it empowers men further, especially the already privileged men, and that implication of this, by empowering that already privileged men, also entrenches the traditional form of female sexuality in this form of sexualization, and that's obviously harmful, and that's where we completely win this debate. This policy don't reduce, so first extension, this policy do not reduce sexualization, but rather entrench the current pre-existing culture of sexualization. The context, we're able to call upon for the current outcry by already aggressively sexualizing women and aggressively objectifying women, such as rape culture. For example, civil society is already trying to be allergic to already sexualized image of women, mainly contributed by feminist movement. What does this mean? This means two things. One, with regards to decapacitation of female being outcry, this policy is utterly misogynistic because the assumption of their affirmative justification is that, because female or civil society cannot combat to the kind of sexualized images right now, we ought to take this policy. We deny the premise because feminist movement had already done many important contributions in order to go back against sexualization. The policy assumption is utterly misogynistic. This is relevant because gender equality is about equal respect of the ability to move the society and shape the contribution of the society and in the form of political discourse. This policy is utterly disgusting and misogynistic, and that's how they're going to reduce and further entrench the gender currently pre-existing gender inequality in that regard. But even if, civil society is not sympathetic to feminists as well as the female, sexualization being normalized and affirmative don't deny that. And here comes the analysis of intersectionality with regards to vulnerability. What does this mean? It's based on our different experience. People react differently to the same social condition. What does this mean? This means that when women are hugely offended and sexualized, or nice ass, big boobs, sexy smile, those sort of things, females are utterly disgusted right now. But on the contrary, when men are vastly sexualized by having cute handsome smile, for example, your heart muscles are quite big and hard, for example, you have six packs, for example, these kind of things is not a aggressive and disgusting narrative, but empowering narrative or rewarding narrative from the perspective of men. What does this mean? This means that even if aggressive form of sexualization really exists, it empowers men. So the point is, the kind of sharing vulnerability never exists on the affirmative bench, and for that reason alone, we should definitely take this debate on clothing option. But two more things to note. One is about the punishing the wrong actor, especially for people who are so vulnerable. What does this mean? The real harm exists to many men in the status quo. So, in order to make sexualization, aggressive sexualization of men, it have to create a form of idealized sexualization of men, such as Cristiano Ronaldo, which, by the way, already existing, and furthermore, it creates a self-stigma for those people who cannot lead to the ideal form of Cristiano Ronaldo body image, for example. So, why is it important? In the status quo, many young girls commit suicide due to false body image complex. So your policy makes vulnerable men already vulnerable to the kind of social stigma, like suicide, those sort of things. So what does this mean? This means that even if equality does exist, we don't value the equality because human lives are so when the commensurate harm or commensurate risk associated with this form of sexualization in human life, and that we ought not to take this policy. Oh yeah, sure.
So if you want to talk about the victim, under the status quo, women who want to sexualize men are now being called as a slut and being victimized and commit suicide, for example. However, how are they less important than those men you wanted for them?
You're engaging with a completely different character because we're talking about the so vulnerable individual who cannot voice out furthermore. We cannot voice out. And here comes another important context we have to recognize. Currently, females have comparatively rhetorical as well as the social power to go against the sexual harassment as well as this bad sexual images by having, sekhara, for example, is always conceived as female victimized from sexual act. But when men are subjected to sexual harassment, men are subjected to kind of sexual negative image, we cannot voice out. Because when I was molested in train, for example, for 3 times in university life, I was not able to counteract, and I was not able to call upon for the police because I was really fearful of how from what perspective I can say I was molested, because dominant image of molestation is me rather committing a molestation against women, for example, and that's bad on that basis. Lastly, it empowers men a lot more. It was ridiculous for affirmative not to characterize how this policy is going to operate. This empowers white privileged men. What does this mean? Find the kind of sexualized image always has to come with traditional blonde, big boob woman, for example, serving to Cristiano Ronaldo as an empowerment or embodiment of sexualized image. What that means that we cannot change the utterly disgusting sexual and gender norm within society. From these reasons, we're proud to oppose. Hello, can you guys hear me? At the back, can you hear me? Alright. The unfortunate reality that we face today is that no singular action can end the suffering and subjugation that women experience. Entrenching a culture of sexualization disproportionately disadvantages and violates women, and that's the reason why we prefer a failing status quo as opposed to a complete situation where we give up on stopping sexualization. There are 2 things I want to answer in this speech. First, does spreading sexualization make men and women equal in the realm of sex, and is making men and women equal in the realm of sex even really that important of a value? And second, what is the impact of sexualizing men, and is this world preferable to status quo? Let's deal with the first. When Prime Minister talked about the goal of reducing objectification and increasing the sexual agency of women, the implicit burden that she took on was to prove that this balances the feelings and experiences of oppression that men and women face.
Let's break this down by answering 3 questions. 1. Will they really feel the same way? I think Shingo explained in superb fashion how men respond to being sexualized. When you tell them that their muscles are big and hard, or maybe something else is big and hard, do you really feel like men are insulted by that? Or do you honestly feel like men feel empowered by this? Men have such a huge amount of penis envy that when you tell them that their dick is big, they feel empowered by this. Why is this the case? And I feel like this was where Shingo took the analysis away from opening opposition. We told you that this is the case because men at a young age are sexualized or conditioned to be sexual beings, whereas women are conditioned to be sexually passive individuals. When you as a man are shown as impotent, you are disempowered. But when you as a woman are shown as demure and not sexual, you are seen as empowered. This shows you the difference in terms of how you were raised as a sexual being when you were a man and when you were a woman. So the reality is, by virtue of how men are conditioned by status quo, the experience of oppression and suffering will never be shared. But what did they tell us? Men are hurt too. Therefore, there will be sympathy. Even if we already told you that men aren't hurt, we're gonna be very generous to opening government and assume that men are hurt. In a POI, I talked about how there's no difference between being sexualized and objectified. Whereas Jasmine talked about the difference because the difference is the harm takes place when there's objectification, and the only extent that they're willing to do is to sexualize and not objectify. Note, the argument that they had was, in harming men, you will benefit women because they become empathetic. If she agrees that they will only sexualize, which means that there will be no harm to men, this means that the benefit will never accrue because the shared experience of harm does not take place. This means that there's a fundamental concession that objectification will take place. And this was where DPM was able to concede that there is no difference between sexualization and objectification, effectively knifing her prime minister. But let's ask then, is this harm really acceptable? No. We said coming from Shingo that at the very least, women who are sexualized in status quo and feel traumatized by this are facing trends wherein people are trying to fight sexualization. Whereas men experience no visible signs of being able to protect themselves from sexual assault and violence simply because men are emasculated when they feel like they are not sexual beings. How embarrassing is it to admit as a male that you were sexually harassed? This is the reason why we will never hear of stories of male rape, or if we do, it's extremely rare. Because it is more emasculating for a man to be a victim of sexual violence because men are expected to just get their dick up and enjoy the sex regardless of what the circumstances are. That's why we think it's fundamentally unfair and unacceptable as a harm because there's no mitigating factor for this harm at all. But they talked about in the POI, what about the female victims? Look, we agree, it's bad that you have male victims, it's bad that you have female victims. That's the reason why we want to try to protect both, but if we can, and in the assumption that Jasmine had that we absolutely cannot eradicate the sexualization of women, at the very least we can make recourses available for those who feel traumatized by excessive sexualization. But lastly, does it really change how men see sexual violence against women? And this is where I want to deal with the assertion of empathy. First thing we told you in the POI was that it won't result in empathy because it will be an antagonistic relationship between men and those who are sexualizing them. Note that even in status quo, we do not aggressively sexualize men. When we have affirmative action policies, when we have things like quotas for women in the workplace, men already react with a men's rights movement. Shingo talked about the experiences of sexualization and how this is likely to trigger you and create trauma and create fear against those people who sexualized you. This means that there will be no feeling of community that Jasmine talked about because what we'd say is that men are likely to recede and become more inwards and depressed if they feel like they are victims. So this is assuming that they are harmed, which we did not concede at all. But even if it's true that you create empathy, what we would say is you should not base empathy off of shared experience because you will never have completely shared existence as a human race. When you pander to human utilitarianism or appeal to selfish nature of humans, like for example, telling them that the reason why they should care is they will be hurt too, what we would say is that people are conditioned to be self-centered as opposed to being empathetic or sympathetic. This effectively harms the long-term trajectory of the feminist movement or any social justice movement because effectively, no one individual will be able to experience the plight of every single person out there. Which means that we have to normalize a state where even if you're not a victim, you have to care. That only happens in our world. But does this really make the experience of sexualization equal? And this was where we had to look at the operative wording of the motion, which is aggressively sexualizing men. In status quo, we do sexualize women. This is something that we're willing to concede. But we do not aggressively sexualize women because there are huge moves to say that aggressively sexualizing women is bad because that is what leads to their objectification, that is what contributes to rape culture, and that is what contributes to a culture of degrading women as a whole. What we would say is that aggressively sexualizing men then is a disproportionate response and does not equalize anything in any circumstance. But lastly, and the last question of the debate is this: what is the impact of sexualizing men, and is this world better than status quo? And this is where I want to deal and engage with the problem that came from CG when they wanted to talk about the long term. This was where Shingo was able to discuss how if you entrench a culture of sexualization, this hurts women more, and because of the concept of intersectionality, where shared experiences do not result in shared feelings of pain and suffering. If you sexualize both men and women, women are more disproportionately harmed because they have more of a feeling of a loss of agency and dignity than men have. So at the very least, in status quo, we present some degree of a challenge to this culture of sexualization that continues to haunt women. In the comparative of their world, we give up that challenge and we just give up to the beast that preys on our vulnerable women and make our men vulnerable to this as well. We've never been prouder to oppose.